Without any further ado, I'll introduce Cory Doctorow. I don't think I need to say all this information, but I will anyway. It's very impressive. A science fiction novelist, blogger, and technology activist. He's the co-editor of the popular weblog Boing Boing, and a contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, Publishers Weekly, Wired, and all sorts of other fine publications. He is formerly Director of European Affairs for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF, a nonprofit civil liberties group that defends freedom in technology. He's a visiting senior lecturer at the Open University in the UK. In 2007, he served as the Fulbright Chair at the Annenberg Center for Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. In addition, he has actually been voted the blogger that most people in the distant future want to reenact. I know that for a fact. And in addition to all of this, he's, of course, a print publisher as well, with books such as For the Win, his New York Times bestseller Little Brother, his latest short story collection Overclocked, Stories of the Future Present, nonfiction as well, with content-selected essays on technology, creativity, copyright, and the future of the future. That sounds like something I should be assigning in some of the classes. And his most recent book is called With a Little Help, and is a very interesting experiment in print-on-demand and self-publishing that we should be looking at. My favorite book of his, though, is actually Makers, which really looks at this kind of world of open-source software and hardware and predicts and kind of creates a series of possibilities around DIY sensibilities and a maker ethic and where those things might go. His title today is a little bit pregnant, why it's a bad idea to regulate computers the way we regulate radios, guns, uranium, and other special purpose tools. Without further ado, I give you Cory Doctorow.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for bringing me out here. If I move to the chair partway through, it's not any formal signal. I've just had hip surgery, and I'm still recovering, so standing after a while might get a little tiring for me. So today I'm going to talk to you about regulation, and I want to start by asking rhetorically what all of these things have in common. First, Viacom demands that Google crack the artificial intelligence barrier and invent a machine intelligence that can detect copyrighted movies as soon as they're uploaded to YouTube and remove them immediately. Second, the CRTC demands that mobile phones be designed in such a way that they can't be deliberately or accidentally modified to interfere with air traffic control signals or emergency radio. Third, a southern state outlaws sex toys. Fourth, the U.S. government outlaws devices that can convert a semi-automatic gun to an automatic gun. Fifth, a health agency prohibits manufacturing superbugs without the appropriate safeguards. Next, a patent holder demands that certain mechanisms be produced under his license or not at all. Next, an intelligence service demands that an ISP, an internet service provider, prevent child porn or terrorist plots from traversing its networks. And then finally, a mobile phone company wants to stop you from taking your subsidized phone to another carrier. The thing that all of those things have in common is that they're all examples from today or from the near future of regulating general-purpose computers. So, talking about regulation, I'll start with a few basics. We regulate, obviously, to attain some end. For example, we might create a series of regulations around the idea of preventing people from coming to physical harm. There are two ways that we can regulate. The first one, if we were talking about copyright, we'd call it prior restraint. And that is to say, we would say there are certain classes of objects you're not allowed to own, or that if you are allowed to own them, you're only allowed to own them under certain circumstances. So we might say you can only get a gun license under a certain circumstance, and certain guns are prohibited altogether. That's really easy. But what we don't say in the realm of regulating people from coming to physical harm, we don't say all objects that might cause harm are restricted or prohibited. And there's at least two reasons that this would be impractical. The first is that the regulatory cost would be very, very high. You would have to have regulators in charge of ensuring that you never put a roll of quarters in a sock or pick up a piece of gravel or a stick. And you'd have to have people who legitimately want to own a length of rope or a crowbar or a bottle of bleach, going through all sorts of hoops just to accomplish the normal everyday tasks by which they live their lives. And even if you did go ahead and pass the regulation and throw all those resources into regulating all those things that might bring someone to physical harm, it would still fail at its stated goal of preventing physical harm as we go along. And that's because any bad person who genuinely wants to hurt someone else, no matter how much regulation you have, still wouldn't find it hard to locate an unregulated, dangerous object. Likewise, no amount of regulation would prevent someone who is in legitimate possession of a dangerous object like a ladder or a piece of string from leaving it where it might trip someone or fall over on someone. So that sort of harm we don't regulate, that harm that arises from general purpose objects. We don't regulate through this prior restraint. Instead, we regulate it under the fact. You're allowed to own all kinds of potentially lethal objects. You're all in possession of them today, from bandsaws to baseball bats. But if you do something naughty with them, we sometimes add new charges to the sheet, like assault with a deadly weapon or criminal negligence. This kind of after-the-fact regulation is really important, and it's the main form of regulation that we use. It balances out those two factors. It balances out objects that are general purpose, that are bad candidate. Beg your pardon, I just lost my train here. This is the first time I've ever given this talk, by the way. Normally I come up and sort of bang on about copyright and say a bunch of things I've said a million times before, but I thought for this conference I'd write something new. So if I stumble a little, please forgive me, and be comforted by the fact that the next group of people I say this to won't have to listen to me fumbling. So objects that are general purpose are bad candidates for strict regulation because on the one hand, there are lots of legitimate uses for them, and on the other, regulation probably won't stop dedicated or genuinely negligent people from doing bad things with them. Which brings us to the computer and the question of what sort of object it is. Is it one of these general purpose objects that can only be regulated after the fact, or is it a special purpose object that we should regulate before it causes some harm? So historically, we've thought of computers as that special purpose object, something more like a handgun or an automobile than like a lever or a wheel or a baseball bat or a handsaw. For one thing, computers are very complicated, and we think of complicated things as being specialized, not least because the number of people who can make a complicated thing is smaller than the number of people who can make general things, right? The number of people who can make a stick is much larger than the number of people who can make a very large integrated circuit. And so we think of these things as being inherently more regulatable because the number of people we have to regulate is smaller, just those experts who are capable of making it. We also think of computers as inherently regulatable because they're expensive, or at least they used to be. And expensive things are also more regulatable than cheap things because there are fewer of them, and when they change hands, it's momentous, right? So we can regulate the movement of millions of dollars because every time $1 million or tens of millions of dollars goes from one place to another, it doesn't happen very often, and when it does, it's kind of a beacon. It shines out. You know, lots of secondary effects ripple out that might alert regulators to an unregulated instance of something that we hope to regulate. And also because they cost a lot and it just doesn't happen very often. And so there are fewer instances in which we might ask the regulator to go to work. But it turns out that the expense and bulk of computers was an extremely temporary condition, and that every year has seen this accelerating trend to computers that get cheaper, smaller, and more powerful. It also turns out that this special purpose of computers was also a passing thing. Once upon a time, we did build a special purpose kind of computer to act for a special purpose file server, or a special purpose ballistics system, or a special purpose weather predictor, or a special purpose television or video game console, or a screen reader for visually impaired people. These would be in some fundamental ways different kinds of devices, all built from the ground up in different ways. But today, the way that we solve any one of these computational problems is by throwing general purpose computing hardware at them. We just take the regular old computing stuff that's sitting under your desk or in your pocket as your phone, and we just throw it at all these problems. We use lower powered ones to solve lower powered problems, and we just throw lots of them together to solve big problems like weather prediction. But what we don't do anymore is build special purpose computers. And so this has become the cheapest and most efficient way to solve a computational problem. And like the man who only has a hammer, we're starting to, or only has a nail, we're starting to see all these things as being solvable with the computational hammer. That we've understood that almost every problem that we have has a computational dimension that is tractable with computation, whether that's education or urban planning or carbon emissions and psychology. We throw greater amounts of computation at solving various components of these problems. Now, this has had some really wonderful side effects, some wonderful externalities. Because everybody relies on that same underlying tool to solve their problem, the general purpose computer, lots and lots of people are pouring money and resource and thought into making general purpose computers faster, more powerful, and cheaper. And then a tertiary effect is that every time computers get faster, more powerful, and cheaper, the number of problems that they might be brought to bear to solve grows. And so you have a kind of a positive feedback loop, because as the number of problems that a computer can solve grows because they're cheaper and faster, more available, and easier to use, the number of people who invest in making computers cheaper, faster, and easier to use grows. And you get this virtuous circle where computers just keep getting faster, easier, and cheaper. But it's not just computers, of course. It's also networks. Networks used to be special purpose, too. We used to have separate parallel infrastructure for, say, cable television, emergency services. We even had a specialized network, you may remember, for sending low-resolution black and white bitmaps that we called fax machines. Right? We had an entire parallel set of infrastructure just for this one tiny purpose. It's like having a special fork for eating fish, right? It's one of those things that seems like a kind of appendix from a gentler era before we figured out that you can eat everything with the same fork. And, you know, this eat everything with the same fork message, this has been something that the net heads have been telling the bell heads. That is to say, the computerized networking people have been telling the circuit switch telephone people for a long time that all of these things that we do with networks, that we build parallel infrastructure for, they're actually just applications for the internet, right? We don't need a telemetry network and a remote surgery network and an emergency services network, a television network and a phone network. We just need one single protean network, and we run all these things on top of it, and we call that network the internet. And this has had that same positive feedback loop, this general purpose network, that has been at play in the general purpose computer. As the number of people who use the general purpose network to solve their problem grows, the number of people who benefit from making those networks cheaper grows, the amount of investment involved in those networks, in that network goes up, as well as the amount of thought put into finding ways to make it cheaper. And as it gets cheaper, easier, and more widespread, the number of people who go, wait a second, I know how I can solve my problem with that network goes up too. So you have these two important general purpose technologies, general purpose computers and general purpose networks, that become more general purpose by the day and cheaper and more widespread by the day. And that means that in the realm of regulation, these two things that we used to think of as being almost the epitome of specialized, expensive, rare, and inherently regulatable expert technologies are becoming more and more like sticks and stones, and becoming less and less good candidates for that kind of prior restraint regulation.